Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us with another Depth in 504 uh, speak. Today, we have an important person with us. We have Jordan Powell. He will be talking about the Cypress best practices. Myself, I don't know about Cypress a lot, so I will be expecting to have a good understanding about what he's going to talk about. Today with me is Kenzie. She will be with us. Hi, Kenzie.
Hello everyone from where you're watching us. Welcome to a new broadcast of Depth in 504. I feel excited because I have a little experience using Cypress.
That's good. I don't have any experience using Cypress. I just work on projects that use it, but me, I haven't used it. So today we are going to have someone that knows a lot about it. So you should uh, you should ask him any questions you have about it, Kenzie.
well, I think, okay, all the developers hate testing, but it's important that you don't ignore the development. Cypress is using to test the UI, in this case, the UI. And in my experience, I use it with React, but you can to use it with Angular, with Vue, anything library that you're using with JavaScript.
That's correct. I've seen it with Nest.js. Okay,
Oh,
just before we have Jordan here, I just want to remind you that we're going to have the Five Stars Conference on the 5 and the 6 of November. So everyone,
yes,
you should be there. Okay,
a learning space. Save
that's
the
correct.
date. Save the date.
Okay, now we will have Jordan Powell with the Cypress best practices. How are you, Jordan?
Hello, hi
Hey,
Jordan.
how are you guys?
Oh, I feel excited.
So
That
this will
music at
be
the beginning was, got me excited. So
just to get you hype up.
yeah, either that or it's the coffee. So
oh,
Or both of them.
I have
both.
my cup of coffee with my Angular cup.
Ooh, I like it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so uh, you can share your screen, okay, right there, and it is all yours. You can start your conference.
Yeah, if
Or
someone has any question, please put in the chat, and we are going to have a little space to Jordan answer them.
correct. Well, thank you guys so much for the opportunity. I know Christian. He's been a friend for, I don't know, a couple a year or so, and when he invited me to come speak, I was very honored to talk to you guys. So today we're going to talk a little bit about uh, sort of Cypress best practices. And I'm going to go under the assumption that it's going to be uh, a very theoretical, sort of high level view of Cypress. Primarily, I'm not sure the level of experience that everyone's going to have. So, I don't want to assume that you guys have a ton of experience or no experience. So, I'm going to try to, as much as possible, cover all of the spectrum of people's learning knowledge. But please feel free to answer any questions along the way, and I'll try to get those answered as best as possible. So here we go. So first of all, is before we can talk about Cypress best practices, we really need to talk about why testing. So the first thing, there's many of reasons why testing can be not only important, but really vital to the success of your applications. And the first thing that I really think that it's important is that it provides sort of self-documentation. So when you write tests as a whole for your application, you sort of inherently get a type of self-automatic documentation in our applications, which is, it's an important part because as time progresses, and we begin to face other parts of that same application as it grows, or we work on other projects, or other people on your team come on your team, or you get new developers, that sort of thing. Documentation becomes more and more important. So testing, the fact that it gives you documentation sort of as a benefit of this is of testing is very important. Second is the fact that it gives you confidence, because as an engineer and as a developer, I don't know about you, but I never write codes that have bugs in them. Well, we all know that that's not true. We all make mistakes. We all make maybe wrong assumptions about our applications, things like that. And so writing unit tests and integration tests and then tests, any sort of automated testing provides us a sense of confidence in our application. So as passing tests increase, or as passing tests happen, it increases our confidence as engineers, as teams, as an organization, and ultimately increased confidence increases our team's velocity, which ultimately is a great win across the organization. Third thing is that we get safe refactoring. So refactoring, I don't know about you, but any application that I've worked on at any of any significant size, refactoring was a very necessary, important part of the application. So really any application that has automated testing, that has good code coverage already in place, it makes refactoring both safe and, what I've found, honestly, fun. And fourth is we have improved UX. So at the end of the day, we want to test mistakes in our application before our users find them. And automated testing helps catch those bugs. And with the type of test that you will be writing with Cypress, it really specializes in these types of things. So the fact that testing provides an improved UX, improved user experience in our applications, that's also a very big win for us. Third, I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with this testing pyramid, but I'm going to break it down here at a pretty low level. So at the very bottom, we have what's called unit tests, which is probably, if you guys are writing any type of testing, it's probably the type that you're most familiar with. These are going to be as a rule of thumb, you're going to probably have the most volume of these tests in your applications, because as engineers, as developers, as we're writing code, we want to make sure that the individual units, the individual parts of our application, that they work as expected. So we want to make sure not only as we're writing it that those tests pass, but also those tests serve as a guard against regression as we refactor, as we write new features in our application over time, that same functionality still stays in place. And so unit tests you're going to ultimately have the most of those in your applications in almost every use case. They're going to also be the cheapest to write. They're generally really easy to write, and they're generally very fast to run. So as a whole, that's why it represents the bottom part of this pyramid, because you're going to have the most of them. They're going to be the cheapest to write and the fastest to run. Well, integration tests is sort of in between a unit test and an end-to-end test. Integration test is basically test the integration between two parts in your system. So maybe one component talks to another component. Well, we can write unit tests to make sure that component A works as expected, and we can write a unit test to make sure that component B works. But we also need to make sure that if those two components talk together, that we need to make sure that the integration between those two also works as expected. So that's where integration tests come into play. And like unit tests, they're very important. They are historically more difficult to write than unit tests, but less difficult to write than end-to-end tests. And so they represent a bigger portion of the pyramid than end-to-end, but significantly less than unit tests. And then ultimately, end-to-end tests are going to be the least, typically going to be the least number of tests that we have in our system. They are going to, in general, be the most expensive to write historically and the slowest to run. Well, we also found that at Cypress, ultimately, we thought that this pyramid, though it is somewhat true as sort of a conceptual reason, we thought that end-to-end tests and integration tests are really important parts of writing applications and writing software. And so we thought, what can we do about this problem to make end-to-end tests and integration tests faster, easier to write, more effective, and ultimately more fun to write? Because I don't know about you, but my previous Cypress experience with writing end-to-end or integration tests was miserable, and I hated using other tools out there. And when I first saw Cypress, that's where I literally fell in love with it. So here we have is, we're asking, okay, what is Cypress? Well, Cypress ultimately is a tool to reliably test anything that runs in the browser. So I know they mentioned earlier that someone said, they were using it for React or they were using it for Angular. But and those are true. But the bigger, I guess, truth is that Cypress can run anything that runs in a browser, and that's really the important thing that to understand about Cypress is that it's fundamentally written in a way that's different than the way other Selenium-based and other testing frameworks are basically written. And so because of that, we get a lot of other things out of the box. So, so why Cypress, right? So the mission at Cypress is to build a thriving and open source ecosystem that enhances productivity, makes testing an enjoyable experience, and generates developer happiness. That's an important thing to note. Like I mentioned before, writing tests, automated tests, especially integration and end tests, historically has been a pain point for developers, that they hated writing and then became flaky. And ultimately, if tests become unreliable, you don't write them and they completely lose the value that they have. And so we hold ourselves accountable to champion a testing process that actually works. So that's really the mission of Cypress, right? But why Cypress, right? Well, there's several reasons, and I've mentioned a couple of them, but Cypress is very popular. For one, it's an open source software, so you can go onto our GitHub repo, you can fork it, you can like it, you can actually create a pull request and help contribute to making features, solving bugs, all those sorts of things. We have over 34,000 stars on the GitHub on our GitHub repository, and I put the graph here of Cypress in comparison to basically the other major testing platforms out there, and you can see this is over a 1-year span. And a year ago today, we were just over 1.5 million weekly downloads, and we just crossed the 3 million downloads a week goal mark. So as you can see, a lot of the other testing platforms are very linear, very flat, and some are regressing, where Cypress is growing at a very, very fast rate. And I think if you've never used it, and you start to use it, you'll understand why. And for most of you who have used it, I'm sure you'll probably agree to this. And hopefully some of the pain points that you have had maybe with Cypress, I can help answer some of those today. So first of all, let's talk about installing Cypress. It's very easy. You just npm install Cypress. This is an example. It downloads Cypress. It unzips the Cypress folder, installs it, and then you run Cypress open, and you will get the Cypress runner. And then you could see it will run a series of end-to-end integration tests very, very quickly right in your browser, which is really cool. So now that I've sort of paved a general framework for what Cypress is and maybe why you should consider it if you haven't, I'm going to talk about some best practices. A lot of these are going to be very conceptual, high level. So please stop me if you have any questions. So this is one that I'm not going to talk a ton about, but I have an example for you. So organizing, logging in, and controlling state. So one of the anti-patterns that we see a lot is people will do a common pattern with that's used in Protractor and other testing frameworks is using page objects. Well, sharing page objects, using your UI to log in and not taking shortcuts, those are things that we consider as anti-patterns, and ultimately there are better ways to do those things in most cases with Cypress. And the best practice that we recommend is to test your specs in isolation, programmatically log into your applications, and take control of your application state. And I have a link here, and I can post this in the chat here when I'm done. But basically, this is a bunch of logging in recipes that are really, really important. We have a bunch of, so I actually work on the Cypress developer experience team, and we actually build out a bunch of examples of how to solve common problems with Cypress, like how to log in different scenarios, how to, do lots of common things. And this link here has an example of, you say, well, how do I actually log in without logging in? Well, we have examples of how to do that with various auth providers. So here's probably one of the most common things that we run into. So selecting elements. So an anti-pattern is using highly brittle selectors that are subject to change. And the best practice that we recommend is using data attributes to provide context for our to our selectors in Cypress and to isolate them from CSS and JS changes, right? Because every test that we write, ultimately you're going to have a selector, because you're going to visit some site or something that basically loads in your browser. Well, you can assert that the browser works, which is not a very useful test, but ultimately you're going to test the things that display in the browser. And in doing so, you have to select certain elements in the DOM. And so you will save yourself a lot of headache if you write selectors that are resilient to changes over time. And I'll use an example here, but here's a common thing. Well, we've used because Cypress selectors, the API is sci.get. Well, there are lots of ways to get things on a page. So the same button could have, right here alone, there's 6 different approaches to getting that same button. But here we're going to see that using the sci.get just button as a generic thing, though it works, it's very, very brittle, because chances that our application only has one button are pretty slim. And even if that is the case, the chances that that is the only button over a long period of time is even more slim. So we basically would never recommend to use that approach. The same thing with sci.get and then a CSS class, because this point it's coupled to our styling and highly subject to change. And again, the same thing. It as our applications change, it's going to it's going to cause issues down the road, because not only will this button maybe change, maybe adds a class or removes a class, but this class is also shared amongst other elements, probably on the same page and definitely in the same application. So again, using CSS classes as selectors are not recommended. So the common thing that I've always seen is people use CSS IDs, which actually worked for an organization, and we had our sprint teams, and we had this team and that team and this team, and we had back-end developers and front-end developers, and we were working on products. But then we had a whole separate team that we didn't really interact with that had that handled end-to-end integration tests. And at the time, I think they were using Protractor, but they were using IDs to select basically the things in the application to verify that it worked. Well, as a new person on the team, I would go in and I would start writing code, and maybe I would delete something, or I would update a class or something like that. Well, then all of a sudden tests started failing. And as a new person, I didn't even know that this testing team even existed. Well, I come to find out that this was a common problem that this organization had, because as we get very isolated, head down into writing code and to what our team's doing and what the challenges that we're actually solving, that sometimes we don't even have context to what other teams in the organization are doing. Well, when we share, IDs, things that can be used for CSS or JS, ultimately, we can mistakenly hurt another part of the team of our organization unknowingly by doing this. So that's why you see the name equals submission, sci.contains, and what we recommend is the data dash attribute, which you can use really anything. So data dash sci, data dash test. I've used data.end to E. It doesn't really matter what that is, but the important thing is that this is the best, most recommended approach, because it isolates all changes from the rest of your app. So CSS changes, JavaScript changes based upon IDs and classes, things like that. They are completely isolated from this, as well as when a new developer or someone goes into a piece of code that they're not familiar with. When you read a data dash end-to-end or data dash sci or test tag, without any context to what that element is or does, you would have a much clearer you'd be less likely to just rip that thing out, because you see that, oh, this tag is being used for something, and I should be careful before I just rip it out, right? So that's one of the important things to know. So here is another thing that we actually have. So the developer experience team at Cypress, we created a real world app, which basically is sort of like a best practices application that has lots of different common things that I shared about. I can put this link in the chat as well. But we actually put 2 custom commands that basically make selecting elements very, very easy. And for those of you who don't know, Cypress comes with its own API for creating commands, and as well as overriding existing commands. So in the Cypress support commands file, this is how you write a command. You would do cypress.commands.add, then the name of the command, and then basically it takes in a function. And you can see here, like, we created a get by selector command. So then it sort of abbreviates selecting elements across your application with just this one thing. And it also, so it helps enforce consistency as well as just the pattern we're talking about, using data attributes. So doing something like this helps enforce that pattern, something we recommend. So here's another thing that really confused me when I first started using Cypress. I was like, wow, this is great. It's in JavaScript. I can just do any JavaScript I want and it works. Well, it's sort of true, but not exactly true. So an anti-pattern is trying to assign the return value of commands with constlet or var. So the reason is because so many first-time users look at Cypress code and think that it runs synchronously. But you cannot assign work or return values of any Cypress commands because commands in Cypress are enqueued and run asynchronously. So the way, if you think of Cypress, the way it works is it's like a command chain. So it's similar to the way promises work, but it's like an abstraction from promises. But if you just think of it as a promise, that will sort of help you get a general feel for it. So basically, Cypress commands, it's a promise or a subject that then gets yielded down to the next command and so forth. But it doesn't run in a synchronous fashion. So because it's a promise, and therefore assigning things won't work. So the best practices is to use closures to access and store what those commands yield you. And I'm going to show you an example right here. So here's like a don't do. This is what I started doing when I first used in Cypress. I would like say I had an anchor tag and I just like assign it to a variable, a constant of a, and cite it get that a, and then I would visit an example or visit this page on my website, and then I'd be like, hey, I want to click the first anchor tag on the website. Well, this won't work because of the way Cypress basically works asynchronously. So the way you do it is working with closures and the .then method that comes with Cypress. So to access Cypress commands, the yield that command yields, the subject that command yields, we use the .then. And if you're familiar with native promises, Cypress.then works basically the same way. You can continue to nest more Cypress commands inside of the then, but important to note that commands outside of the then will not run until all the things inside of it are finished. So the same way promises work, it runs each one of those as a whole before it moves on to the next. So here you'll see an example in code of sort of how this sort of how you would do this handle this problem using closures. Another common pitfall and best practice is visiting external sites. So one of the very first things that many users attempt to do is involve third-party servers in their tests. And I was mentioning this to one of the hosts, and she was mentioning that this was kind of something that she struggled with. Well, you may want to access in our applications. You're almost always going to access third-party servers in several instances. Well, so the anti-pattern is like trying to visit or interact with sites or servers you do not control, essentially, and third-party API. Well, so you may have several situations, like you want to test logging in when your app uses another provider, verify your server updates a third-party server. You want to check that your email to see if that the forget your password link works. Well, initially you may be tempted to, like I mentioned, is use site at visit to actually visit the third-party website and maybe actually physically logged in, which we talked about in the very first anti-pattern. Well, however, you really should never use the UI to visit a third-party site when testing for several reasons. One, it's incredibly time-consuming and it slows down your tests. Two, the third-party site may have changed or updated its contents because you have no control over that, what it does. Three, the third-party site may have issues outside of your control. The third-party site may also detect that you are testing it via script and block you. That's always a funny one. As well as they could be doing like the third party could also be doing like A and B testing. So if you guys are familiar with that, that's something that happens as well. So here is the best practice we recommend. So only test what you can control in Cypress. So try to avoid requiring a third-party server. When necessary, always use the site at request API to talk to third-party servers via their APIs. And here's another link that I can post of some of the examples of how to basically handle logging in. The logging in scenario is probably one of the hardest things and most frequent questions we get asked around. So here's some examples. So when logging in, there are basically like, here's 3 different ways we recommend you could approach this. So one is stub out the OAuth provider and bypass using their UI altogether. So you could trick your application ultimately into believing that the OAuth provider has passed its token to your application. Second being that if you like actually have to get a real token, you can use site at request and use the API provided from your OAuth provider to programmatically basically get to make a request to get a token from the provider. That way you bypass the UI of the third party provider, and you run in and you avoid the problems I mentioned on the previous slide. Third, instead of having your test code instead of having your test code bypass OAuth, you could actually ask your server to help you. So if the OAuth token is basically in your application is just used to generate like a user in the database, oftentimes OAuth is only useful to initially get that and create the user in your database. Well, that's where if you could create a custom endpoint or something in your server that would handle this for you, and then ultimately the end-to-end test would bypass authentication altogether. So here is for when dealing with third-party servers. So sometimes actions that you take in your application may affect another third-party application. Situations like these are not common, but it is possible. And so like after running your test, instead of trying to visit site at visit on GitHub, you could use like site at request. So instead of like, say you have an endpoint on a server, instead of going to that server, like I said, you can use the site at request to basically fake a request to that. And then here's a third one, is verifying emails get sent. So there's two, basically, here's two recommendations that we have. If your application is running locally, you can send emails directly through an SMTP server. You can use so if your application is using an SMTP server, it's always hard to say, SMTP server, you can create a temporary local SMT server to basically dispatch those emails and then test that they work. And I have a link for how to do that as well, if you guys would like for me to send that. And then the other option is if your application is using a third-party email server like Gmail or something like that, you don't really need to create an SMTP server, but you can use the API provided by the actual email third-party email service to do that for you. So, which is really cool. And the other awesome thing is because Cypress can load and receive HTML in an email, we all get in those emails that have HTML in them, and you click on them and they look great, and you buy this thing. Well, again, this is just HTML, so Cypress can actually load those and verify functionality, visual style, all those things, which is really cool. How am I doing on time? Okay. Try to go quickly here. So another thing is relying on previous test state. This is another thing that I was actually just talking with someone about a week ago about this. So there's an anti-pattern of coupling multiple tests together. And the best practice is basically that tests should always be able to run independently from one another and still pass. So the great thing is that you only need to do one thing to know if your tests do this. So when we have like describe blocks and we have it blocks, well, it functions basically tests an individual. It's an individual description of a test. Well, that if you tag on dot only to the test, it will basically refresh the browser, or sorry, you refresh your browser, but when the browser refreshes, the tests that have it dot only on, it will only run those ones. So by doing this, you will know that if that test will be able to pass without the previous tests running, which is important. So here is an example. So when we rely on previous state, so here's basically two ways of solving this problem. So the first is combining if you have multiple tests, combining them into one test. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. But the second one is probably the most ideal, in that we, by doing this, we we are resetting the state between each test, and it ensures that nothing in previous tests leaks into the subsequent one. So we're also paving the way to make it less complicated to write multiple tests against the default state of the form. So that way each test stays lean, but each can run independently and pass. And so here's an example of by throwing shared things across in a before each hook, we get to simplify our tests, and they can both run independently without error. They can run in any order, together or separately. So here's another thing I mentioned from the previous slide that I'd get to, but the thing that we were taught, as a pattern with unit tests was to only test one thing at a time. So the anti-pattern for writing Cypress tests is acting like we're writing unit tests. Well, the reason why we did this with unit tests was when assertions failed, you relied on the test title to know what failed. Second thing is that you were told that adding multiple assertions was bad and accepted this as a truth, and sort of this whole single responsibility principle. And And 3, there was no performance penalty for splitting up multiple tests because they ran really fast. Why you shouldn't do this in Cypress? Because writing integration in an init test is not the same as writing unit tests. You should always know that you can visually see everything that runs in Cypress, and therefore assertions when they fail in a large test, like you can see, it doesn't have to be broken down in the single test. Cypress also runs a series of async lifecycle events that reset state between tests, and resetting tests is much slower than adding more assertions. So sort of the way Cypress works as a whole, it's just more performant and to actually run it as a series of assertions along the way, because for performance reasons, as well as you can visually see things fail in Cypress. So the best practice is to add multiple assertions and don't worry about it. So to get at something we just talked recently, a few slides back, was an anti-pattern we see is people using, instead of the before each hook, they use the after each hook. Well, when you put state in an after hook or an after each hook, it provides, you get basically no upside. With the only thing you get is downside with no upside, because putting the responsibility of resetting that state at the end of your current test for the next test does not guarantee that it will always run, and that now your tests are coupled together. So if we put that code in the before each hook, it will always run prior to the test, even if you refresh Cypress in the middle of an existing test. So as well as here is, there's a couple more quick ones here. Unnecessary waiting. So this is one of the things that we talked about with the host, is that Cypress, you almost never need to use the side.wait command. Waiting, basically, like anti-pattern that it's very common with other testing platforms like Protractor and things like that, is waiting for like an arbitrary period of time. If you find yourself doing it, there's probably almost always a much simpler way to do it, because commands like side.request will not resolve until it actually receives a response from the server. So you can use aliases to basically wait for that request to come back to finish before it continues to the next thing. In fact, commands like side.get will actually automatically retry until the element is found in the DOM. So sometimes you have the thing where, like, if you're using a component or something that has a transitions to the screen, and maybe it's not visible for a few, like 200 milliseconds or something like that. Well, something like that historically would fail your test. Well, the good thing is that Cypress automatically retries your test for that, and it waits a reasonable amount of time to say, okay, the likelihood that this thing is not here, or it is the assertion you're trying to do, it waits a reasonable amount of time, and then before failing. So you don't really need to do a wait unless you actually need to assert that a certain amount of time went by before continuing, something like that. So we recommend using route aliases, assertions to guard your Cypress from proceeding until an explicit condition is met. So, and then finally here, this is not as popular, but basically Cypress runs because it runs in the browser. When you're running it locally, you need to serve your app locally, and then you need to serve Cypress separately, that then calls your local app. Well, one of the things that we sometimes see, I should say, is basically trying to do this all as one command. So trying to start your web server from within Cypress script like side.execute or side.task. Well, basically there is a bunch of performance reasons why this is not ideal. And so we always recommend to start your web server prior to running Cypress. As well as you can also set a base URL in your Cypress config file, And that way, basically, you only have to then put your routes past your base into your commands, um, and it saves you a lot of time, and it actually improves performance as well. So here are some resources. The Cypress docs is, in my opinion, they're very good. We're always trying to improve these. So there's a lot of guides, a lot of recipes. We have there's a link for the resources. We also have Cypress is getting ready to release its component testing, which is basically kind of like it's a mix between some other forms of testing like Storybook and like Jest, and it's kind of like a mix between unit testing and like a traditional Storybook or something like that, and it kind of mixes those, and it's going to be a really cool way to test components. That's going to be releasing soon, so there's a link for that. Continuous integration obviously is important as developers, so we have a bunch of guides for different continuous integration providers and how to get that up and running with your in your pipelines, as well as we also have Cypress Dashboard is a paid sort of service that helps speed up your CI process. So it runs your tests in parallelization and provides some really good analytics and that kind of stuff. So it's a really cool tool as well. So overall, these are just some general links that I recommend if you're new to Cypress. I know I really fast covered a lot of things, but again, I'm Jordan Powell. I am the developer experience engineer at Cypress. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and all those things. GitHub at Jordan Powell 88. There's my link to my blog, and I want to say thank you. And at this point, I will be happy to answer any questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, there are no questions, but I just enjoyed your talk because all developers hate the test, but it is necessary.
Yes.
Okay, this was my first introduction to Cypress. I got a better understanding of it. I'm going to test it on a few of my projects. On what technology would you recommend me to use it? I can use it on whether on React.js or AngularJS, since I don't have this. This will be my first time.
Sure. So are you familiar with NX?
Yes.
So one of the great things about NX is when you create a new application inside of NX, it automatically creates a Cypress end-to-end test for you. So you don't have to do any setting up. So if you are familiar with NX, I recommend using it because you automatically get Cypress out of the box. Or like I said, the thing is you don't even need an application to run Cypress. You could create a Cypress application and go to Google and start typing in things. Now Google will probably eventually recognize that you're not a real human and block you. But the point is you could go to any website, anything that runs in the browser, and write tests just to practice, if that makes sense.
Okay. Nice.
But Cypress
And
as a testing tool is framework agnostic, so it can run on anything in the browser. It really doesn't matter.
okay. After I get my first experience with Cypress, do you think I can test everything within an application? Is that a realistic approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's always the question of how do I know if I have enough tests, or how much is too much, how much is not enough? Well, it
Right.
depends upon a lot of factors. One being how much time do you have? Obviously, the more tests you have, if they're written well, you're going to have more confidence that there's no bugs in your application. Because with Cypress, I mean, you could do very you could test so many things. You could test all your API stuff, your requests, your responses, all those things. You could test all the things a user would do, clicking buttons and making sure text is this color and has these classes. Um, there's an infinite number of things you could test. So I think the the real question would be is finding out the things that are most important um, to your application and getting it started. But like if you're not if you don't have any now, that's fine. But another good thing that I recommend is I've found you can actually do TDD with Cypress. So I've done where maybe I have, and this is helpful when you have, if you're working on a feature like a story that maybe the API work isn't done yet or incomplete. Well, you can go in and say, okay, what's the object going to look like coming back? Well, you can go in, create a request, and stub out that response, and you can actually then finish out all of your work, and it will fail. But then until you get it to pass, it'll start. Once your feature is done, it will actually pass. And the good thing with that is, so I worked on a pretty large enterprise company, and it was very difficult flow. Like I had to test like 10 things just to get to the thing I cared about. And so every time I refreshed my browser, had to start this whole process over. Well, so what I ended up doing was then I would just test that whole thing, write that all in Cypress so that I could get to the thing I cared about really quickly automatically. So it would just automate that whole thing. So then I could just care about the thing I actually cared about. So that's the cool thing too. It can really speed up your dev cycle. So sometimes it was worth taking a half a day or a day to write a test so that the thing I actually cared about I could do much faster.
Okay, so in
Okay.
the end, it will save you much more time.
Yes, it definitely can save you time. It's like anything. It's kind of like tech debt. If you don't deal with it now, you'll deal with it later. Well, it's like if you can write tests now, it's going to take a little bit of time, but in the end, it's probably going to save you from letting bugs go into production, or help stop regression, that kind of stuff.
Like a security net.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that we could use Cypress to test like an API. Are we able
Yeah.
to test UI
Yes.
library? Uh-huh.
So, well, so it would depend. So it would depend on what types of things you want to test. So that's where Cypress component tests are really going to focus on. Actually, you could have. So the way you run Cypress, and then it basically displays like the browser, and it basically shows your website in a browser. Well, component testing will actually do the same thing. It'll just show your component, and you'll be able to interact with it and assert that it's this color blue, it has this class, and if you hover over it, it has this class or this color. So you can do all those types of things with it. Um, and then obviously like the integration between components and that kind of stuff too, you can obviously test too. So
So if I have any problems doing the Cypress integration, where can I get more information, like a community, besides the documents that you provided before?
yeah. So you can reach out to me individually. You can message me. I'd be happy to help. It's literally my job to help the experience of developers using Cypress. So I can either point you to the right, like chances are the questions you have, we have already something already built out for how to do that. So like we have migration guides for like if you're using Protractor, like how to switch from Protractor to Cypress, or maybe you've never started. We have guides for how to get started with doing, writing certain types of tests or something like that. So we have a lot of, we really have a lot of stuff on our docs, but if there is a specific question, like I said, please reach out to me individually, and be happy to answer specific questions or point you guys in the right resources and that kind of stuff. So,
Okay, that's really nice.
Well, I think that the most important thing to know is about with Cypress you can to know the behavior of your screen of your application because with
Yes.
Jest you can to test only the logic, but you can to watch the behavior of your application in this case. It's
Yeah. And so one of the at a previous company I had worked for, they had a lot of manual testers and they would go in and test things. Well, the thought of automated testing was kind of scary to them and they didn't trust it, right? But when I could show them that they could actually see it working in the
Mhm.
browser, it was like it clicked in. They're like, ah, like it works. I can see it working. The other cool thing, and I didn't put it in my slides, but when you because it runs in the browser, you get access to all the browser things. So you get access to all the network activity. You can use the developer tools to inspect an element. Or if you're using Redux, you could have the Redux extension. So all the things that you get in the browser, you get all of that as well. So console logs, you could see console logs of your application, as well as when you actually click through the different like steps that happen in Cypress, it'll actually log out everything that command did. So there's so many things to talk about. I had to narrow it down, but I would say that that's one of the benefits is you actually get like, especially if you're a front end developer like me, you like to see things happening. the that's where the great thing for me with Cypress was you get to see everything that the test is doing, and it gives like a level of comfort and assurance that it's actually like working the way I think it is. So
Yes, I have a question. Do you have your favorite JavaScript library to use with Cypress? So, in my case, I use Cypress with React, and it's really easy to implement it, but I don't know if it's the same experience using with Angular or Vue.
yeah, so I love using it with. I've used it a lot with Angular. I've used it a lot with React. In the end, Angular, React, and Vue, when it gets compiled, it's just going to run JavaScript in the browser. So your browser doesn't know if it was Angular or Vue or React. So in the end, then you're just going to have Cypress that's just going to go in and read the JavaScript and do all the things it does. Um, so as in a technical standpoint, there is no difference. I personally love Angular. I've kind of grown up in the Angular community, um, and so I've done a lot of it with Angular, but I've also done quite a bit with React as well, and it works great for really any framework. So Gatsby,
If,
anything. So.
okay, got it. I have my last question is in the ID assignment of the components, are there best practice about how assign an ID in our elements?
Uh, so one of the slides that talked about using the data dash attribute, and let me, or I don't have my screen up, but anyways, basically there is here, okay, there is a best practices, and you can see a lot of this. So right here, you can add like data dash, and you can name this whatever. So we recommend like data dash sci or dash test or end to end, and then so then when you go and select, you do it like this, and then that way your CSS, like no, you don't have to worry about people going in and changing an ID or a selector, a class, something like that. This is literally just a data attribute that Cypress that you would then use in Cypress, and it doesn't matter if this button changes to a div or they changes the class or the ID, any of those things, it doesn't matter because it's looking specifically for this.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions on the chat. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very clear. It was my first introduction to Cypress. As you mentioned before, well, I work an X project, and I saw Cypress there, but I haven't been using it. So now that you said that it will be a good start, I will try to start with it, with the NX project you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's they do all the hard work for you. Not that it's that hard, but they do all of it, and it's like literally just it's begging you, please do write tests, please write tests.
That's correct, and I have some issues because when I was building the project for production, the Cypress library was a little bit large, so I got like the curiosity about what's this, what's Cypress, and how can
Yeah,
I use it.
yeah,
Okay, I think I have a last question for you. For
yeah.
example, it is necessary to know about Jest before to use Cypress?
It's not necessary. Uh, Again, Cypress doesn't replace Jest or something like that, or Karma or something like that. Those are just going to be really fast, testing one function at a time. One method that says, that A plus B equals C, or like it's always going to do one little part. Um, it's in some ways I don't. I mean, it's not some of the knowledge that you would use in Jest would carry over, but it's not like it's a prerequisite to do both. So most people who are new to Cypress have at least some experience with Jest or unit testing. But if you didn't have any experience, it wouldn't uh, stop you from being able to learn Cypress. And a lot of the terms and things like that are kind of, excuse me, similar. But like I said, it's not. There's no prerequisites or anything like that. Oh,
Got
the
it.
other thing I
Thank you.
wanted to mention is
Okay.
Cypress. It's not out yet, but soon we're actually going to have an entire curriculum on how to basically get started from zero and learn like how to basically just create your own new app and like how to do all these common things. And you'll like go in and it will keep track of the status of all the steps and things like that. So I'll be posting that on my socials when we actually get that live. We're working on that. It's a lot of work to put out a large amount of curriculum like that, but that's also a resource that's coming soon that would help a lot of people getting started with Cypress.
Oh, nice. Got it.
Okay, just meanwhile we get more questions. We are just going to share the lives that we're going to have on the next week, and if there are any more questions, we will be finishing. Okay.
Yeah, Jordan Powell he's going to stay in our conference. Please save the date.
Absolutely.
Ok, solo recordándoles que el 5 y 6 de noviembre vamos a tener la conferencia, entonces los esperamos ahí, no se le olvide. Ok. En los siguientes live vamos a tener a Parlova Vázquez con los tips para el proceso de reclutamiento. El jueves 28 de octubre, de estas charlas muy importantes para quienes quieren conseguir trabajo, entonces no se la vayan a perder.
Sí, solo recordando que Parlova es reclutadora para el área de IT, entonces sería bueno que todos, ¿verdad? Compartan este anuncio, ¿verdad? Estamos en Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, entonces para que puedan compartir el enlace y todos se puedan unir el día, ¿verdad? Correspondiente.
Correcto. De ahí el sábado 30 de octubre vamos a tener a Ángel Sevilla aplicando patrón de strategy en C Sharp. Entonces vamos a ver cómo es C Sharp, de las tecnologías ahí que más queremos, entonces ahí no se lo vayan a perder tampoco. Entonces, como agradecimiento al sponsor tenemos a JetBrains. Gracias por tomarse el tiempo para comprender nuestro propósito y poder decidir patrocinar esta gran comunidad. Y como última charla tenemos a Cristian el 27 de octubre subiendo imágenes a Firebase Storage desde Netcore. Entonces, Cristian ya lo conocen Entonces no se vayan a perder esa última charla. Okay, Jordan, it appears that there aren't any more questions. It was a pleasure to have you here. Uh, I'm speaking for me. I didn't understand a lot about Cypress, and it was a pretty good introduction to Cypress. Okay, okay? So it was a very good presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jordan.
My honor. I'm
Okay.
glad. Anytime.
It will be nice to have you any other time here. You give a very you give gave a very good presentation. So if you want to give another presentation, just message us. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, Jordan. Let's see you next time. Okay. Bye bye.
Adios.
Bye bye, everyone. Adios.
Adios.
Adios.